Okay, so we're going to jump into the very first lesson, if you will, after setting up some of the guidelines and looking over some other stuff. So this is the prologue unit before we actually jump into unit one. And we're going to start by stepping back in time, and we are going to look at three documents. And the reason behind this is that these three documents are going to form the basis of much of what it is that we will be talking about throughout the course of the year. And I my hope is that it'll make some sense as we go through here and give you something to really think about, because the ultimate reasoning behind this is that I want you guys to be able to, when we're talking about something, to like have it in the back of your heads. Oh, wait a second, we kind of talked about this in context of the the Constitution, or in the context of what George Washington had to say. And we're going to start by looking at today and next class the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And we're going to be looking at some examples specifically from there. So the first thing to understand, yes, I know that the Declaration and the Constitution are separate documents. But in order to fully understand and appreciate them, you really have to look at them both together. All right? Over a decade separated the two of them. But they really are a sort of like original and sequel. And it might actually, in some ways, if you want to look at, like, say, the movie analogy, the Declaration of Independence was the first film. There was a not so successful spin-off sequel effort called the Articles of Confederation, and then the incredibly successful follow-up, the Constitution. You can look at them separately, but in order to truly make sense of everything, they have to be looked at together. So the first thing, Abraham Lincoln referred to, I'm going to see if I can get a pointer here. Fireworks, spotlight, highlight. Yeah, I'll try highlight. Abraham Lincoln referred to, no, that's not going to work. Okay. The Constitution as a silver frame that outlined and highlighted the golden apple that was the Declaration of Independence. Individually, they're beautiful, but together they are magnificent. They complete each other. Now, when we delve into this, there are three basic assumptions that underlie both documents, and we're going to look very quickly at how those are set up in the Declaration. Assumption number one is that there is a creator. There is some higher power, higher force than human beings. Assumption number two is that there is truth, like we talked about with the Star of Truth. Truth is the idea that right and wrong, good and evil, are knowable things that can be learned through reason and logic. Truth number three, or assumption number three, the principle of subsidiarity. That's a big, like, $5 word, but if you can throw it out there and use it correctly, you'll score a lot of brownie points among people, or just astound them with your geniusness, which, is always a fun thing to do. Subsidiarity is the idea that power is delegated or shared or given in sort of a top-down approach, a hierarchy, if you will. At the top of the pile, the big pointy of the pyramid, is God, the creator. He makes the world, he makes people, puts people in the world. Then there's people. People, for a variety of reasons, don't always play well in the sandbox. And conditions can be difficult and hard, and there's all sorts of things that go on. So, in order to protect and preserve and keep themselves safe, as well as to protect, preserve, and maintain the stuff that they get and have, people establish governments and give those governments certain powers. So, just to be clear, we understand how this little scale works. God is at the top. He makes people. He gives people the ability to organize and run themselves. People then make a government. So if you want to think back to the 6 principles of economics that we use, this is principle number 4. People will establish systems based on their economic needs and wants. So in order to protect property and personal possessions and privacy, people are willing to set up governments and give some of the authority that belongs rightfully to them to a government for the purpose of protection, maintaining order, and ensuring the best possible chance for success for anybody. So it's important to understand that these 2 documents do not contradict each other at all. Thomas Jefferson, who was the primary author of the Declaration of Independence, John Adams and Benjamin Franklin were basically editors, wrote almost everything in the Declaration. James Madison, the secretary at the Constitutional Convention, the person whose notes formed the basis for the Constitution, and the person who wrote the Bill of Rights in the Constitution, was Jefferson's BFF. I mean, they were actually so close that essentially it was like a father-son relationship. Madison would never, ever contradict Jefferson. Now, the last thing to understand is that these documents are designed to last. They are adaptable as time progresses and changes and evolves, but they are not transient. It's important to realize that the Founding Fathers foresaw a time when civilizations and cultures would advance well beyond where they were. So the Constitution was set up as a framework that could be changed and altered and fit whatever changes in society came through a process known as amending. The founders did not believe in the idea of inventing things in the Constitution. They believed that the powers and everything else were written out to be general enough to be applied in certain circumstances. But if it came to something major that you needed to change it or go through the process of law creation outlined in the Constitution. So this is sort of the basic framework and background about what these 2 documents are. Okay, so an example of being adaptable. The Constitution makes the president the commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy, does not mention the Air Force, let alone Space Force. It doesn't mean the president's not the commander-in-chief of those as well, but as the military expands, the president's role expands to cover those. On the flip side, you cannot make the argument that because the police are armed, and we refer to them as the police force, they're an armed force, therefore the president is in charge of all the police. That's not how it works. That violates the principle of subsidiarity. Local government handles the police, or at maybe county government for sheriffs, or state government for state patrol. But those are specifically given over to localities or municipalities or states, and they are removed from the control of the federal government. So the Constitution is not meant to be interpreted to, suck in all of these like ideas just because you kind of want it to. If you desperately have to look somewhere in the Constitution and try to justify what you want by changing how the language works or reinterpreting things so that it fits a narrative, you're probably not using it the way that it was intended to. Okay? Now, next. The very beginning of the Constitution is a statement, of the Declaration of Independence, is a statement of ideas or beliefs. It is sometimes referred to as the creed. Aside from being a marginal 90s rock band, um, a creed is a statement of beliefs. It's usually applied to religious beliefs. But the opening paragraph of the Declaration is the creed of the Declaration. It is the statement of beliefs of Thomas Jefferson. And we're going to look at that really quick here. This is part of what your activity is. But if we look here, okay, I'm going to sort of highlight a couple of things in particular. Okay, so again, we have three basic underlying concepts that we talked about already. Concept number one, okay, is found here in the very first sentence. Okay, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them. So first of all, there is right there, Thomas Jefferson references the fact that there is a creator. So this is number one. There is a creator. Move down. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Okay, there's number two. There are truths. Creator, truths. And last but not least, let's go down here. It is the right of the that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just power from the consent of the governed. That word consent means approval. Okay? So this portion right here means that governments exist because people give them authority and power. That's subsidiarity. Now, let's look a little bit further about some of the things that it says. Okay? Let's go back over here. So Jefferson specifically says there are two truths that are self-evident. That means completely obvious. All men are created equal in the image and likeness of some kind of higher power. And because of this, they are given certain unalienable or undeniable rights. Those rights are sort of in order of how they would work. Life, because if you ain't alive, you don't have anything else. Liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, this particular little set of phrases right here, this was not Jefferson's creation. This little group of phrases right here come from an English philosopher named John Locke. And Jefferson took them almost word for word. I say almost because if you guys remember from last year, for those of you who were in 7th grade history, Locke's three rights were life, liberty, and property. Thomas Jefferson is making the argument that you do not have to have wealth or property, but that you are entitled to pursue the acquisition of them and to pursue those things which will fulfill you and make you complete and, going back to the star of individuality, make you the best version of yourself. Now, this section here of these truths is where modern historians, probably for about the last 50 or 60 years, have begun to cry BS on Thomas Jefferson. Because how do you claim that all men are created equal and have unalienable rights if you own slaves? You're a hypocrite. It's a load of caca. It's meaningless. It's pretty language. It's meaningless. This is where we have to get into the subtle area of context. And we have to look at a big picture. So the first thing to understand and realize, the Declaration of Independence that we have is not Jefferson's original draft. In Jefferson's original draft, he formally condemned slavery as practiced by the British Empire as being a moral evil and one of the rightful just reasons that America had to separate from England. The southern colonies forced that passage to be stricken because their economies were dependent on slavery. And this is the real tragedy of Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson genuinely and wholeheartedly believed that slaves were people and they should not be enslaved. And to be very clear, with very few exceptions, and off the top of my head, there is no notable, noteworthy, or like important exception that I can think of. No slave owner at the time of the Revolution denied that slaves were people. They accepted they were fully human. What they basically argued is that circumstances and conditions had simply placed them in this area of servitude. And some people were made to be in charge, some people were made not to be. The reason that I bring up the issue of slavery is because when we jump into our first official unit, you have to realize that the United States had just come out of the Civil War. And for the better part of a decade after the war, we were in an area known as the era of Reconstruction. And it was a really whacked time to be in America. But much of the problem of Reconstruction had to do with what the heck do you do that you suddenly now have like 8 million brand new citizens, like literally overnight, with the former slaves. And that actually relates itself to a different question of how much authority does the government have to deal with all of these problems? The issue of slavery, as we will talk about in our next class, was something that the founders were keenly aware of. And there was a growing movement within Western European societies that slavery needed to be gotten rid of. That it was morally evil and it corrupted society. And as we will talk about in the next class, that idea is actually built into the Constitution that slavery will be going away. But if we look at economic principle number 6, people's choices sometimes have unintended consequences. The law of unintended consequences hops in on the issue of slavery. And it's what ends up leading down the very dark path that we end up in, that is the Civil War. So let's go back to this now for a second, because we'll hop into that and explore those issues on Monday or on next class. And I hope that you will see a little bit more why it can be very legitimately argued that the founders didn't do enough to end slavery, but it is very true that they were not protecting it. So the second part here is the issue of the relationship of this idea of truth and the creator and subsidiarity. Truth and rights exist independent of human beings. They are given and created by a higher authority, and therefore they cannot be given or taken away by a government. Jefferson is very, very explicit about this idea that there is no ability of the government to rightfully, legitimately take away rights, and if it does, they can be legitimately removed, as in the government. Now, the last part here is the document's underlying recognition that the only way that America will work is if there is some form of belief system. Now, understand when we talk about this, the founding fathers were of various and sundry beliefs and backgrounds. Most of them were Episcopalian. That is the Americanized version of the Church of England. There were some Presbyterian Christians. There were some Catholic Christians. There were some minor other sects of Christianity. There were Quakers. There were also deists and agnostics. Deists are people who believe that God is present in nature itself. When Jefferson uses the term nature's God, he is speaking as a deist, because essentially that's what he was. And some of the founders were agnostics. An agnostic is a person who believes that there's a higher power, but doesn't really know what it is or understand it. Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin both really had no personal use for organized religion. Jefferson actually went so far as to remove all references to miracles from the Bible and to write his own version of it that was basically like a philosophical work. Benjamin Franklin, for his part, he really avoided church. But both of them ensured the survival of churches in their home states. In Philadelphia, where Franklin lived, many, if not most, of the Revolutionary War era churches, no matter what faith they were built with money from Ben Franklin. Thomas Jefferson not only donated money, but he ensured, when he was governor of Virginia, that all religions would have the equal opportunity to worship and believe as they want. So they both recognized that while religion wasn't exactly for them, that without religion, there would be no common basis of morality or beliefs that you could fall back to. And those beliefs and morality were necessary for a functioning government and a productive government and a good, healthy government. So what we're going to look at next class is how the Constitution was set up to be the realization of Thomas Jefferson's vision in the Declaration of Independence. Okay, so work on that worksheet. Peace and love.